ash and aerosolized coolant coated Abelardo's throat. Sovereigns weren't supposed to bleed, yet Vashti sat in the ruined durasteel of her flagship, a jagged hull strut pinning her thigh. She tried to stand, ordering her shattered leg to hold the weight of her empire. It collapsed when Abelardo hauled her up, his own blistered hands screaming against her ceremonial armor. He braced for a royal execution. He never expected a monarch to bury her terrified, weeping face into his grease-stained collar. Ash coated the back of Abelardo's throat, a gritty paste of pulverized durasteel and aerosolized coolant. Every time he exhaled, his lungs rattled with a dry, hollow wheeze. He leaned heavily against a scorched bulkhead, his combat boots slipping on a deck slick with hydraulic fluid. The flagship Reliant was dead. Its heart, a massive fusion drive 3 decks down, had stopped beating 30 minutes ago, leaving only the sickening high-pitched whine of failing emergency batteries. Through the haze of smoke, Abelardo watched her. Vashti Ashcroft, sovereign of the core worlds, was currently attempting to drag herself across a jagged field of shattered glass and torn metal. Her ceremonial armor, a marvel of ballistic weaving and gold inlay, was ruined. The left pauldron was sheared off entirely, but it was her right leg that drew Abelardo's exhausted gaze. A massive shard of structural resin had punched through the carbon fiber greave, pinning the armor to the muscle underneath. Dark, arterial blood pulsed sluggishly from the entry wound, pooling in the grooves of the deck plating. Abelardo stayed still. He was a combat engineer, a wrench-turner whose primary job was keeping the atmospheric scrubbers from choking the crew on their own carbon dioxide. He wasn't Royal Guard. He wasn't a hero. His left wrist throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm, where he was pretty sure a fracture was swelling against his gauntlet. He just wanted to close his eyes. He wanted to melt into the dark corner of the corridor and let the deep, freezing void of space claim them both quietly. "Command," Vashti gasped, her voice cracking. It wasn't a plea. It was an order issued to an empty room. "Command, acknowledge." Her comms unit was a blackened lump of melted plastic on her collar. She knew it was dead. Abelardo knew it was dead. But she kept talking, her fingers scrabbling against the cold floor, searching for purchase. Abelardo spat a mouthful of metallic-tasting saliva onto the deck. He pushed himself off the bulkhead. His knees popped audibly in the quiet gloom. He walked toward her, his heavy boots crunching over the debris. The sound made her snap her head up. Her face was a mess. Ash and sweat had turned her usually immaculate skin into a canvas of grey streaks. A severe laceration crossed her left cheek, the edges of the wound already swelling. But her eyes were furious. They were a pale, icy blue, and they locked onto Abelardo with the intensity of a targeting laser. "Engineer," she rasped. She recognized the faded orange insignia on his shoulder pad. "Help me up." Abelardo stopped 2 feet away. He looked at her leg, then back at her face. "You shouldn't move, ma'am. The artery might be nicked. If you put weight on that, you'll bleed out before the emergency bulkhead seal." "I did not ask for a medical assessment," Vashti snapped. Her breath hitched a sharp intake of air that betrayed the agony she was trying to mask. "I am the sovereign. I do not die sitting in the dirt. Help me stand." Abelardo stared at her. For a moment, a cynical laugh bubbled in his chest. Here they were, millions of miles from the nearest inhabited rock, their ship a floating tomb, and she was worried about posture. She was clinging to a hierarchy that had evaporated the moment the kinetic penetrator ripped through the hull. "Suit yourself," Abelardo muttered. He didn't offer his hand. He stepped closer, bracing his stance, and waited. Vashti placed her palms flat against the deck. Her knuckles went entirely white. The servos in her remaining armor whined in protest. With a guttural sound that was half growl, half sob, she pushed herself upward. Abelardo watched the mechanics of her failure with a detached, grim fascination. He saw the exact moment the torn muscle in her thigh gave way. He heard the wet, sickening, tearing sound beneath the resin shard. Vashti managed to get her left foot planted. She locked her knee. Then she tried to shift her center of gravity to bring the injured right leg underneath her. It didn't just fail, it collapsed with absolute finality. Her cry was sharp, a genuine sound of shock and pain that shattered her regal facade. She pitched forward, directly toward the jagged metal debris jutting from the floor. Abelardo moved before he made the conscious decision to do so. His body simply reacted, driven by years of muscle memory in high-stress environments. He lunged forward, catching her under the arms just before her face met the steel. The sudden impact of her weight drove him down to one knee. Fire shot up his fractured wrist, stealing his breath. "Don't!" Vashti hissed, thrashing wildly in his grip. "Unhand me! I can walk!" "No, you can't!" Abelardo growled, his voice stripped of any deference. The smell of her was overwhelming up close, a mix of expensive ozone-scented perfume, copper blood, and raw, acrid fear. She shoved against his chest plate. It was a weak, trembling push. "I am commanding you. Command is dead." Abelardo shouted, his voice echoing off the twisted bulkheads. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hiss of leaking oxygen. He looked down at her. Her eyes were wide, the fury suddenly replaced by a stark, naked realization of her vulnerability. Abelardo didn't give her time to rebuild her walls. He shifted his grip, sliding his uninjured right arm behind her knees and his throbbing left arm around her back. He ignored the screaming protests of his joints. He planted his boots, gritted his teeth, and stood up, lifting her entirely off the ground. She gasped, her body going rigid. For a split second, Abelardo braced himself for a strike. He expected her to claw at his face, to demand a court-martial, to invoke some ancient rite of execution for touching a monarch without consent. Instead, she did something unbelievable. Her rigid posture crumbled. The fight drained out of her all at once. Vashti slumped against his chest. She buried her face in the hollow of his shoulder, her hands coming up to grip the fabric of his flight suit with desperate, white-knuckled intensity. She was shaking. Not a subtle tremor, but violent, full-body shivers. Abelardo froze. He held a queen in his arms, expecting steel, and found only a terrified, fragile human being. The corridor was a nightmare of twisted geometry. Abelardo walked with slow, deliberate steps, testing the floorboards before committing his weight. Every third step brought a jolt of pain up his spine. Vashti wasn't light. Without the power assist of her suit's servos, the ceremonial armor she wore was just dead weight. 30, maybe 40 pounds of dense plating on top of her own mass. Abelardo's biceps burned. Sweat stung his eyes, blurring his vision, but he couldn't wipe it away. He kept his breathing measured, inhaling through his nose, exhaling through his mouth. In out. Step pause. "Where are we going?" Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. It lacked the sharp edge it had earlier. It sounded small. "Auxiliary engineering." Abelardo replied, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "Deck 4. It has manual life support, overrides, and a med kit. The blast doors are heavy enough to keep out whatever boarding party blew us out of the sky." She didn't argue. She just tightened her grip on his collar. Abelardo couldn't reconcile the woman in his arms with the sovereign he had seen on the holovids. The Vashti Ashcroft on the screens was a force of nature. She was the woman who had negotiated the armistice of the Outer Rim without blinking a monarch who wore power as comfortably as a second skin. She was cold, untouchable, a symbol carved from ice and authority. But the woman he was carrying felt incredibly warm. He could feel the rapid, frantic beating of her heart pressing against his ribs. He could hear the slight, wet hitch in her breathing every time he accidentally jostled her leg. "I'm bleeding," she whispered. It wasn't a complaint. It was a statement of fact, tinged with a rising panic. "I know," Abelardo said. He adjusted his hold, trying to keep her leg elevated, but the awkward angle only made his wrist throb harder. "I've got pressure on the artery above the wound with my forearm. You're losing blood, but not fast enough to die in the next 10 minutes. Comforting. The sarcasm was weak, a defensive reflex. "I'm an engineer, ma'am. We operate on realistic timelines, not comforting ones." They reached a collapsed section of the hallway. A massive support beam had buckled, tearing the ceiling down and leaving a gap barely 4 feet high. Cables hung from the gap like metallic vines, sparking with residual current. The smell of burning insulation was harsh, catching in the back of the throat. Abelardo stopped. He looked at the gap, then down at his own trembling legs. "Put me down," Vashti said. She shifted her weight, trying to pull away from him. "You can't carry me through that. I'll crawl. If you drag that leg, you'll tear the femoral artery," Abelardo said flatly. "And if you try to squat walk with 200 pounds in your arms, your knees will give out, and you'll drop me directly onto a live plasma conduit." She shot back. She lifted her head, looking him in the eye. The vulnerability was still there, but a spark of her usual command had returned. "Put me down, Reed." Abelardo blinked. "You know my name." "You're wearing a name tape, idiot," she said, nodding weakly toward his chest. Abelardo looked down. "Right." Reed A stamped in faded black ink over his heart. He felt a brief flash of annoyance at himself for being surprised. "I'm not putting you down," Abelardo said. "I am giving you an order, and I am ignoring it." Abelardo adjusted his grip again, his jaw set. "If you crawl, you die. If you die, the chain of command falls to Gideon Lewis. And frankly, I'd rather take my chances with a blown-out knee than live in a galaxy run by that sociopath." Vashti stared at him. For a second, Abelardo thought she was going to strike him. Her eyes searched his face, looking for insubordination, for mockery. She found neither. Just the grim, exhausted stubbornness of a man who had decided he was going to get a job done, regardless of the cost. Slowly she rested her head back against his shoulder. "If you drop me, I will have you shot." "Noted," Abelardo muttered. He approached the collapsed section. He bent his knees, feeling the cartilage pop in protest. He lowered his center of gravity, ignoring the burning fire in his thighs. He had to lean backward slightly to keep Vashti balanced, shifting her weight entirely onto his arms and core. "Hold on tight," he warned. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face into his collarbone. He could feel the dampness of tears and sweat soaking into his undersuit. It was an intensely intimate gesture, stripped of all protocol and rank. At that moment, they weren't sovereign and subject. They were two terrified animals trying to survive a dying steel cave. Abelardo ducked under the beam. A sparking cable brushed against his shoulder, sending a painful jolt of electricity down his arm. He grunted, his muscles clenching, but he didn't drop her. He focused on the ground. 3 steps. 4 steps. The heat from the debris was intense, baking the air out of his lungs. 5 steps. 6 steps. He cleared the wreckage, stumbling into the relatively open space of the corridor beyond. He didn't stop to rest. He couldn't. He knew that if he set her down now, his arms would refuse to pick her back up. Almost there. He breathed mostly to himself. Vashti didn't answer. Her breathing had grown shallow. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving only the crushing weight of shock and blood loss. Abelardo felt a cold spike of dread in his stomach. He picked up his pace, his boots hammering a frantic rhythm against the deck. The blast doors to auxiliary engineering were partially jammed, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Abelardo didn't have the leverage to force them open while carrying her. He gently lowered Vashti to the ground, propping her against the wall beside the door. She moaned softly as her injured leg touched the deck. Her eyes were half closed, the pupils sluggish. "Hey," Abelardo said, tapping her cheek lightly. "Stay awake. Don't go to sleep on me. I'm just resting my eyes." She slurred her head, lolling to the side. "Bad idea." Abelardo turned to the blast doors. He jammed his fingers into the gap, gripping the heavy steel. He braced his boots against the bulkhead and pulled. His injured wrist screamed. The pain was blinding, a sharp, metallic taste flooding his mouth as he bit the inside of his cheek. He let out a ragged, ugly yell, putting every ounce of his remaining strength into his legs and back. The gears in the door groaned, grinding against bent tracks, and then with a screech of shearing metal, the door gave way, sliding open just enough. Abelardo collapsed onto his back, panting, staring up at the flickering emergency lights. He gave himself 3 seconds to hurt. 1, 2, 3. He rolled over, crawling back to Vashti. He slid his arms under her and dragged her through the gap, pulling them both into the dark, echoing space of the auxiliary bay. He hit the manual override on the inside wall. The heavy doors slammed shut, the locking mechanism engaging with a heavy, reassuring thud. They were safe. For now. The bay smelled of heavy machine oil, stagnant water, and the sharp tang of ozone. It was freezing cold. Abelardo dragged Vashti to a clear spot near the primary coolant tanks, laying her flat on her back. He scrambled to the emergency locker mounted on the far wall, his hands shaking as he tore open the latch. He pulled out a heavy-duty medkit, a thermal blanket, and a portable floodlight. He clicked the light on, setting it on the floor so it illuminated her leg. It was worse in the harsh, white light. The resin shard was as thick as a man's wrist, jagged and black, driven deep into the outer thigh. Blood soaked the grey fabric of her undersuit, spreading in a massive, dark stain. Abelardo knelt beside her. He ripped open the medkit, pulling out a pair of heavy trauma shears. "I have to cut the armor away," he said, his voice tight. "And the suit. I need to see the entry point." Vashti's eyes fluttered open. She looked at the shears, then at him. "Do it." Abelardo worked quickly. He cut through the ballistic weave of her pants, exposing the pale skin of her thigh. He felt a sudden, inappropriate flash of self-consciousness. He was kneeling over the Sovereign, stripping away her clothes in a dirty, freezing engine room. But the sight of the wound immediately drowned out any other thought. The skin around the shard was purple and black, the flesh torn and ragged. Blood welled up continuously, running down her leg and pooling on the cold floor. "Is it bad?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper. She didn't look down. She kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "It's not great," Abelardo admitted, grabbing a handful of sterile gauze. "The shard missed the femoral artery, or you'd already be dead. But it tore through a lot of muscle, and it's nicked a vein. I have to pack the wound to stop the bleeding." He looked up at her. Her face was chalk white. She was trembling again, her teeth chattering. "This is going to hurt," he said softly. "A lot." Vashti swallowed hard. She reached out her hand, hovering in the air for a second, before she grabbed the sleeve of his flight suit. "I know." Abelardo took a deep breath. He pressed the thick wad of gauze directly against the wound, right at the base of the jagged shard, and pushed down with both hands. Vashti screamed. It was a raw, primal sound that echoed off the steel tanks, a sound devoid of any dignity or restraint. She arched her back, her nails digging viciously into Abelardo's arm, tearing through the fabric and scratching his skin. I'm sorry, Abelardo muttered, keeping his weight pressed onto his hands. He hated this. He hated the sound of her pain. He hated the wet, spongy feeling of the gauze soaking through under his palms. Stop, she gasped, thrashing wildly. Stop, please. I can't. If I let go, you bleed out. Abelardo leaned closer to her face. Look at me. Look at me, Vashti. He didn't use her title. He didn't care. Her eyes snapped to his wide and wild with agony. Squeeze my arm, he commanded, his voice firm but quiet. Squeeze it as hard as you want, but don't move your leg. Breathe, just breathe. She stared at him, her chest heaving. Slowly the thrashing stopped. Her grip on his arm tightened until he thought she might break his skin, but he didn't flinch. He maintained the pressure on her wound, his hand steady, despite the exhaustion threatening to pull him under. For a long time, the only sounds in the room were her ragged breathing and the distant hum of the atmospheric scrubbers kicking in. The bleeding slowed. Abelardo carefully unwrapped a roll of pressure, bandaging, wrapping it tightly around her thigh and over the gauze, securing the shard in place so it wouldn't shift. When he finally sat back, his hands were covered in her blood. He wiped his brow with the back of his wrist, leaving a red smear across his forehead. Vashti lay limp on the floor, her eyes closed, her breathing finally evening out. She looked impossibly young, stripped of the heavy crown of her office. Abelardo reached over and draped the thermal blanket over her chest, tucking the edges in to trap her body heat. As he pulled his hand away, her fingers twitched. She reached out blindly, finding his wrist and gripping it weakly. Abelardo froze. He looked down at her hand, small and pale against his thick, scarred skin. He didn't pull away. He just sat there, in the dim light of the flood lamp, the cynical walls he had built around himself, cracking just a little bit more in the quiet cold of the broken ship. Frost bloomed across the edges of the primary atmospheric scrubbers, creeping along the brushed durasteel like white mold. The auxiliary bay was hemorrhaging heat. Without the main fusion drive, the ship's internal temperature was in a free fall toward absolute zero, the residual warmth bleeding out into the vacuum of space. Abelardo sat with his back against the base of a coolant tank. His legs were splayed out in front of him, boots scuffed and smeared with a mixture of hydraulic fluid and sovereign blood. He stared at his left arm. The wrist was swollen to the size of a grapefruit. The skin was stretched taut, painted a sickening mottled canvas of deep purple and angry yellow. Every time his heart beat, a fresh wave of nausea washed over him. It was broken. Badly. He glanced over at Vashti. She was still under the thermal blanket, her eyes closed. The foil material crinkled softly with every shallow breath she took. Her face had lost that terrifying, chalky paleness and settled into an unhealthy grey. She wasn't dead, but she was hovering on the edge of a deep, shock-induced sleep that Abelardo knew she might not wake up from if the ambient temperature dropped much further. He needed both hands if they were going to survive the next few hours. Abelardo gritted his teeth and pushed himself up. His knees popped the cartilage, grinding after the exertion of carrying her. He rummaged through the debris near the jammed blast doors, eventually finding a sheared piece of rigid plasteel piping and a spool of heavy-duty electrical tape. He sat back down, propping the floodlight so it illuminated his lap. He placed the plasteel against his forearm. It was too long, but it would have to do. He clamped the end of the tape between his teeth, tearing off a long strip. The real problem was the alignment. The bone was pressing upward, distorting the shape of his arm. If he just taped the splint over it, the tension would cause nerve damage. He had to set it. Abelardo picked up a grimy rag he used for wiping grease off manifolds. He rolled it into a tight cylinder and shoved it between his molars. He took a deep breath, the freezing air burning his lungs. He wrapped his right hand firmly around his left hand, interlacing his fingers. 1, 2. He didn't wait for 3. Abelardo yanked his hand forward and twisted sharply to the right. The wet, hollow crunch of bone grinding against bone sounded obscenely loud in the quiet bay. Pain, hot and blinding white, exploded behind his eyes. He bit down on the rag so hard he felt a molar crack. A low, guttural groan tore its way out of his throat, muffled by the dirty cloth. He clamped his eyes shut, his entire body breaking out in a cold, clammy sweat as the nausea finally won. He leaned to the side and dry heaved violently, his stomach contracting around nothing but bile and adrenaline. That was incredibly stupid. Abelardo gasped, spitting the rag onto the deck. He cracked one eye open, chest heaving. Vashti was watching him. Her head was turned slightly, her pale blue eyes tracking him from beneath the edge of the foil blanket. She looked utterly exhausted, but the sharp, analytical intelligence in her gaze was fully awake. Had to be done. Abelardo managed to croak. His throat felt like sandpaper. He grabbed the electrical tape with trembling fingers and began awkwardly wrapping it around his wrist and the plasteel splint, pulling it tight with his teeth. "You are in shock," Vashti noted. Her voice was weak, lacking its usual commanding resonance, but the inflection was purely observational. "Your pupils are dilated. You are sweating in sub-zero temperatures. If you pass out, I cannot drag you to a heating vent." "I'm not going to pass out," Abelardo muttered, tying off the tape. He leaned his head back against the cold tank, closing his eyes for just a second. The throb in his wrist was now a dull, continuous roar, rather than a sharp, stabbing pain. It was an improvement. Marginally. "You shouldn't have brought me here," she said. The crinkling sound of the blanket intensified as she tried to shift her weight, followed immediately by a sharp hiss of pain. She froze, panting. "I'm a liability." Abelardo opened his eyes. He looked at her. Really looked at her. Her hair, usually pinned in an immaculate, intricate braid, was plastered to her forehead with sweat and grime. The gold inlay of her armor was chipped and blackened. She was shivering a fine, rapid tremor that vibrated through the foil blanket. "You're a human being with a piece of hull plating in her leg," Abelardo said flatly. "I wasn't going to leave you to bleed out in a hallway. Royal or not, even if it costs you your own life." She challenged her chin, tilting up a fraction. It was a reflex. The sovereign reasserting dominance. "Don't flatter yourself," Abelardo snorted, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead with his good arm. "I'm not dying for you. I'm just too stubborn to die for Gideon Lewis. And right now, keeping you breathing is the biggest middle finger I can give that bastard." Vashti went terribly still. The mention of the name seemed to suck whatever little warmth remained right out of the room. She stared at the ceiling, her jaw clenching so hard, Abelardo could see the muscle ticking beneath her bruised cheek. "Lewis," she whispered. The word carried a weight of venom that made Abelardo's skin crawl. "My own Lord Commander. He was the only one with the fleet deployment schedules. He routed us through this sector. Yeah, well, he routed a kinetic penetrator right through our engineering deck too," Abelardo said. He dragged himself closer to her, bringing the med kit. He pulled out a sterile water pouch and tore the corner off with his teeth. He held it out to her. "Drink." She eyed the plastic pouch with deep suspicion. "It's not poisoned, Your Highness," Abelardo said, rolling his eyes. "It tastes like plastic and iodine. Drink it. You lost a lot of blood. Your body needs volume." Vashti slowly reached a trembling hand out from under the blanket. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the pouch. Her skin was like ice. She brought the pouch to her lips and drank greedily some of the water spilling down her chin to mix with the grime on her neck. When she finished, she let her hand drop heavily to the floor. He bought the Praetorian Guard. That's the only way a boarding party gets onto the Reliant undetected. My own shadows. She turned her head to look at Abelardo. The absolute desolation in her eyes caught him entirely off guard. She wasn't just a monarch who had lost her ship. She was a woman realizing that every person she trusted had smiled at her while holding a knife to her spine. "Why didn't they buy you?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Abelardo let out a short, humorless laugh. "I fix air scrubbers and unclog waste recyclers on Deck 6. Lewis doesn't know I exist. To him I'm just part of the ship's plumbing. Expendable." Vashti stared at him for a long moment. Then she let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a dry sob. "Expendable," she repeated softly. "It seems we finally have something in common, Reed." The sound started as a deep, resonant hum. Something felt in the teeth before it was heard by the ears. Abelardo stopped breathing. He pressed his hand flat against the deck plating. The metal vibrated a rhythmic, heavy thumping that grew steadily louder. Someone was using magnetic boots on the decks above. "Kill the light," Vashti hissed. Abelardo lunged forward, slapping his palm over the switch on the portable flood lamp. Absolute, suffocating darkness instantly swallowed the room. Without the visual anchor, the cold felt immediately sharper, biting through his thin undersuit with malicious intent. He crawled backward, blindly feeling his way until his shoulder bumped against the coolant tank. He slid down until he was sitting right beside Vashti. He could hear her breathing short, terrified little gasps. Clank, clank, clank. The footsteps were moving down the primary corridor outside their blast doors. It wasn't a rescue team. Rescue teams moved frantically, shouting, cutting through debris. These footsteps were methodical. They were hunting. Abelardo reached out in the dark, his hand brushing against the foil of her blanket. He found her shoulder and gripped it firmly. A silent command. "Do not move." Vashti didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch. Her hand found his good wrist in the darkness, her icy fingers wrapping around it with a desperate, crushing grip. She was shivering so violently that Abelardo could hear her teeth clicking together. The heavy footsteps stopped directly outside the jammed blast doors. Abelardo held his breath. His lungs burned. He stared into the pitch black, his mind painting terrifying pictures of heavily armed mercenaries with thermal optics standing just on the other side of the steel. If they had a thermal scanner, they were dead. The bay was freezing, making the two of them glow like beacons on a screen. A muffled voice echoed through the thick metal. Abelardo couldn't make out the words, just the harsh, tactical clipped tones of military comms. A heavy metallic thud struck the door. Someone was testing the lock. Beside him, Vashti let out a microscopic whimper, a sound so small and terrified it broke whatever hardened exterior Abelardo had left. She was the sovereign of 12 star systems, and she was huddled on the floor of a freezing utility closet, waiting for the executioner's bullet. Without thinking, Abelardo shifted his weight. He unzipped the heavy insulated top of his combat flight suit, pulling his good arm out of the sleeve. He leaned over her in the dark, wrapping the thick, fire-retardant fabric over her shoulders, over the foil blanket, trapping whatever heat they had left. He pulled her against his chest, tucking her head under his chin to muffle the sound of her chattering teeth. She stiffened for a fraction of a second, protocol and pride, violently rejecting the intimacy. Then the survival instinct overrode it all. She buried her face into his chest, her hands clutching at his undershirt, trembling like a leaf in a storm. Outside, a torch flared. Abelardo could see a thin, faint line of orange light tracing the edge of the jammed blast door. They were trying to cut the lock. Abelardo's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt around his waist with his right hand, his fingers closing around the heavy steel wrench strapped to his tool belt. It was a pathetic weapon against plasma rifles, but he wasn't going to just sit there and let them put a bolt through her head. "If they come in," Abelardo whispered, his lips practically touching her ear so the sound wouldn't carry. "I'm going to rush the door. You stay down. Play dead." "No," Vashti breathed against his collarbone. Her voice was shaking, but there was a sudden fierce edge to it. "No, I won't let you. You don't get a vote. I am your sovereign." "Shut up," Abelardo hissed softly. "For once in your life, I've shut up and let someone else take the hit." The orange light at the door grew brighter. Sparks sprayed through the small gap, hissing as they hit the freezing moisture on the floor. Then a loud static squeal erupted from the corridor, followed by a voice barking a sudden urgent command. The cutting torch shut off instantly. The heavy magnetic boots clanked rapidly against the deck, moving away from the door. The sound faded down the corridor, eventually swallowed by the ambient groaning of the dying ship. They were gone, called away to another sector, or maybe the ship's structural integrity was failing faster than they wanted to deal with. Abelardo didn't move. He kept his arm wrapped tight around Vashti, his hand still gripping the wrench. They sat in the pitch black for 10 minutes, listening to the silence, listening to each other breathe. The smell of ozone from the cutting torch drifted through the gap in the doors, mixing with the metallic scent of her blood. It was a sickening cocktail, a reminder of exactly how close they had come. Slowly, Vashti's grip on his shirt loosened. She didn't pull away from his chest, but the violent shaking began to subside. "They'll be back," she said quietly into the dark. It wasn't a question. "Probably," Abelardo agreed. The cold was beginning to seep into his own bones, now his exposed arm covered in goosebumps. He ignored it. He kept the flight suit draped over her. "Read," she murmured. "Yeah, if they come back." She paused. He could feel her taking a slow, painful breath against his ribs. "Don't rush the door. Give me the medkit shears. I'd rather bleed out on my own terms than give Lewis the satisfaction of parading my corpse on the holonet." Abelardo swallowed hard. He thought about the pristine, untouchable woman on the propaganda posters. He thought about the raw, desperate human clinging to him in the dark. "Nobody is bleeding out today," Abelardo said. He adjusted his grip on the wrench. "We're just going to have to figure out how to be extremely aggressively stubborn." A very small, entirely unroyal sound escaped her. It took Abelardo a second to realize she was laughing. It was weak, and it ended in a wince of pain, but it was real. "Aggressively stubborn," she repeated, the ghost of a smile in her voice. "I suppose that is a strategy." Abelardo rested his head back against the tank, staring into the dark. "It's the only one I've got, Your Highness." Time dissolved into a slow, agonizing loop of shivering and silence. Abelardo didn't know if they had been sitting in the dark for 20 minutes or 2 hours. The only metric of passing time was the steady drop in temperature. It was a creeping, insidious thing. First, it took the feeling from his fingertips, turning them into clumsy wooden blocks. Then it settled in his joints, making his knees ache with a dull, throbbing pressure that rivaled the pain in his broken wrist. Beside him, Vashti's breathing had grown concerningly shallow. The violent shivering had stopped, replaced by a terrifying stillness. That was the danger zone. When the body gave up trying to generate heat and just started shutting down the extremities to protect the organs. Abelardo nudged her shoulder with his good hand. "Hey, wake up." No response. He leaned closer, his face inches from hers. He could feel the faint, icy puff of her breath against his cheek. "Vashti, open your eyes." He pinched the soft skin on the back of her hand, twisting hard. She gasped a weak, ragged sound and tried to pull her hand away. "Stop," she mumbled, her voice thick and slurred. "Tired." "I don't care how tired you are. If you go to sleep now, your heart stops." Abelardo forced himself to sit up straighter, grimacing as his bruised ribs protested. He fumbled in the dark until he found the portable floodlight. He didn't turn it on fully, that was begging for a sniper bolt through the door, but he covered the lens with his heavy work glove and clicked the switch, allowing a sliver of muted, red-tinted light to bleed out between his fingers. In the dim glow, Vashti looked horrific. Her lips were a stark, bruised blue. The ash on her face made her look like a corpse already laid out for viewing. "We have to move," Abelardo said, his voice a low, raspy croak. "Where?" she whispered, not opening her eyes. "Ship is dead." "We are dead." "Not yet." Abelardo coughed a dry, rattling sound that tasted like old dust. "The atmospheric scrubbers in this bay are whining down. They're running on residual battery power. Once they stop, the carbon dioxide builds up. We suffocate before we freeze. We need to get to Deck 2. The executive escape pods run on an independent analog circuit. Lewis's lockdown wouldn't have disabled them manually." Vashti slowly forced her eyes open. They were glassy, unfocused. "Deck 2 is 3 levels up. The elevators are dead." "I know. I cannot climb a ladder, Reed. I have half a leg." "I know that too." Abelardo shifted his weight, turning his body toward her. "Which means I have to pull you up. And to do that, we need to lose the weight." He gestured to the heavy ceremonial breastplate and the remaining greave on her left leg. It was gold-inlaid ballistic rated and completely useless right now. Vashti looked down at herself, then back at him. A flicker of her old pride sparked in her dull eyes. "This armor is a symbol of the Sovereign. It was forged in the core fires of—" "It's an anchor," Abelardo interrupted brutally. "And it's freezing the sweat against your skin. You want to die wearing a symbol, fine. But I'm not dying with you." She stared at him, the red light casting harsh shadows across her cheekbones. For a moment, the silence stretched heavy and stubborn. Then she let out a long, shuddering sigh. "The releases are under the arms," she said softly. Abelardo moved closer. His left wrist screamed as he awkwardly braced himself, relying entirely on his right hand to find the clasps. He had to lean over her, his face inches from her neck. She smelled like copper ozone and a deep underlying scent of sour adrenaline. His clumsy, numb fingers fumbled with the intricate locking mechanisms. "You're shaking," she noted her breath ghosting over his ear. "I'm freezing, and I have a bone grinding against its own splint," Abelardo muttered, finally feeling the left clasp give way with a metallic click. "Forgive my lack of finesse." "I am not criticizing." She shifted slightly, trying to make it easier for him to reach the right side. "I am merely observing. Stop observing and help me push this thing off." He popped the second clasp. Together they shoved the heavy front plate forward. It hit the deck with a loud, hollow clang that made both of them wince and freeze, waiting for the sound of boots returning. Nothing came. Underneath, she wore a simple, dark grey compression tunic. It was soaked in sweat and blood, clinging tight to her ribs. Without the armor, she looked smaller. Fragile. The illusion of the untouchable monarch was lying on the floor in a pile of useless metal. Abelardo stripped off his heavy tool belt. He dumped the wrenches, the hydro spanners, and the plasma torch onto the deck. He kept a heavy coil of braided utility cable and a carabiner. "Sit up," he instructed, looping the cable over his shoulder. Vashti struggled her face, contorting in pain as her injured leg shifted. Abelardo didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just grabbed her by the shoulders and hauled her upright, letting her lean heavily against his chest while he wrapped the thick cable around her waist, feeding it through the reinforced loops of her tactical pants. "What are you doing?" she rasped, gripping his forearm as he yanked the cable tight, making a harness. He secured the carabiner to the cable at her back, then attached it to a loop on his own chest rig. "You're going to use your good leg to push on the rungs. I'm going to do the lifting. If you slip, I catch you. If I slip—" He paused, looking her in the eye. "We both fall down a very dark hole." Vashti swallowed hard. She looked at his hastily splintered left wrist, the crude electrical tape dark with his own dried blood. "You cannot pull my weight with that arm." "Watch me," Abelardo said. He clicked off the floodlight, plunging them back into absolute darkness. "Keep your hand on my shoulder. Don't let go." Maintenance shaft 4C smelled like roasted copper and dead rats. It was a narrow vertical tube meant for automated repair drones, barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through with their shoulders squared. The ladder was a series of slick, grease-coated rungs, welded directly to the bulkhead. Abelardo stood at the base of the ladder, the heavy blast door of the auxiliary bay shut and sealed behind them. He had cracked a single glow stick, snapping the chemical vial and hanging it from his teeth. It cast a sickly, jaundiced green light that barely penetrated the gloom. "All right," Abelardo mumbled around the plastic stick. He spat it out, letting it fall down his shirt to rest in the collar of his flight suit, freeing his mouth. "On my back. Now." Vashti hobbled forward, leaning heavily on the wall. She reached out her arms, wrapping around his neck. The moment she transferred her weight onto him, the utility cable connecting their harnesses snapped taut. It bit viciously into Abelardo's ribs. He let out a sharp hiss, buckling slightly under the sudden 200 pounds of dead weight pulling backward. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her face buried in the space between his shoulder blades. "Don't be sorry, be light," Abelardo grunted. He reached up with his right hand, gripping the first greasy rung. He didn't use his left hand. He couldn't. Instead, he hooked his left elbow over the rung, relying entirely on the joint and the fabric of his sleeve for friction. He planted his boot. "Push with your left foot," he commanded. He pulled. The muscles in his right shoulder screamed, tearing with the effort of lifting both their weights. Vashti pushed simultaneously. They moved up one rung. Abelardo's vision swam. The pain in his left wrist, jolted by the movement, flared into a blinding white-hot spike that traveled straight up to his jaw. He bit his lip until he tasted blood, refusing to let the groan out. "Again!" he gasped. Right hand grips, left elbow hooks, pull, push, one rung. The shaft was a sensory nightmare. The metal was freezing, leaching the last bits of warmth from Abelardo's fingers. The smell of old grease was suffocating. Above them, the shaft stretched into an oppressive, endless black. By the 10th rung, Abelardo's breathing was a ragged, wet sound. Sweat poured into his eyes, stinging sharply, but he couldn't wipe it away. His right forearm felt like it was full of shattered glass. "Wait!" Vashti gasped behind him. Her grip on his neck was strangling him. "Wait, Reed! My leg!" Abelardo stopped, locking his right arm and leaning his forehead against the cold steel of the ladder. "What is it?" "The shard," she panted, her voice trembling violently. "It's hitting the rungs. It's tearing." Abelardo squeezed his eyes shut. If the resin shard shifted and severed the femoral artery now in this narrow tube, she would bleed to death on his back in under 3 minutes. There was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. "Turn your knee out," he ordered, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Rotate your hip outward. Keep the wound away from the metal." "I can't. The muscle is torn." Vashti, turn the damn knee, or you die right here. He felt her shift. A sharp, muffled sob ripped from her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that made Abelardo's stomach violently churn. She wasn't a sovereign right now. She was an animal caught in a trap, tearing her own flesh to escape. Okay. She breathed her breath hot against his wet neck. Okay. Go. They climbed. 15 rungs. 20. The green light from the glow stick cast erratic, swaying shadows against the curved walls. Every movement was a brutal negotiation with gravity. Abelardo's left sleeve was tearing from the friction, exposing the raw, bruised skin of his inner elbow to the rusted metal. He didn't feel it. His entire world had narrowed down to the next rung. Just one more piece of steel. Just one more pull. You're slowing down, Vashti whispered. It wasn't an accusation. It was terror. I'm pacing myself, Abelardo lied. His right hand was cramping the fingers, locking into a claw. The cable dug so deeply into his chest he was certain it was cracking his ribs. 30 rungs. The grate for Deck 3 passed them by a dark, silent, rectangular opening. Abelardo ignored it. They needed Deck 2. Tell me why he did it. Abelardo ground out, desperate to distract himself from the burning in his muscles. Lewis, he had the fleet. He had the power. Why blow up the flagship? Vashti was silent for 3 painful pulls. Because I was going to sign the treaty, she finally said, her voice weak but steady. The Outer Rim Armistice. Lewis believes peace is a vulnerability. He believes the core worlds must conquer, not compromise. By killing me here, making it look like a rim ambush, he gets his martyr. He gets his eternal war. Politics. Abelardo spat, hooking his elbow over the next rung and dragging them upward. Millions of people die so one idiot can feel tall. That is the nature of empire, Reed. Well, your empire sucks. A quiet, breathless sound that might have been a laugh brushed his ear. I will be sure to add that to my next address to the Senate, assuming we survive. We're surviving. Abelardo snarled his boot, slipping slightly on a patch of grease. His stomach dropped into his shoes as they slid down, an inch before his right hand, locked in a death grip on the rung above. He hung there, his arm trembling violently under the sudden jolt of weight. Vashti clamped her mouth shut, suppressing a scream as her injured leg bumped the wall. I've got you! Abelardo gasped, his vision spotting with black dots. I've got you! He looked up. The faint, ambient light of Deck 2 filtered down through the heavy grating above them. They were 10 feet away. Abelardo pulled. He didn't know where the strength came from. Maybe it was spite. Maybe it was the sheer, cynical refusal to let a man like Gideon Lewis win. He hauled them up, rung by agonizing rung, until his face pressed against the underside of the cold metal grate. He reached up with his right hand, shoving against the heavy steel mesh. It didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his exhaustion. He shoved harder, ignoring the tearing in his shoulder. Nothing. The locking mechanism was engaged from the top. It's locked, Abelardo whispered, the utter defeat in his voice, echoing loudly in the narrow shaft. Through the mesh he heard a sound that made his blood run completely cold, the heavy rhythmic clatter of magnetic boots. They weren't patrolling this time. They were running, and they were heading straight toward the escape pods. Vibrations from the heavy boots above shook loose a rain of rusted flakes and oxidized paint falling directly into Abelardo's eyes. He blinked rapidly, his tears mixing with the gritty dust, blurring his vision. The footsteps were directly overhead now, pausing just a few yards down the corridor from the grate. "They're searching the deck," Vashti whispered, her breath hitching. The utility cable dug relentlessly into her waist, but she didn't complain. She clung to his back, a silent, shivering weight. Abelardo looked at the locking mechanism. It was a simple mechanical deadbolt, heavy steel, thrown across the underside of the mesh. It was designed to be opened with two hands, one to lift the release lever, the other to push the grate. He didn't have two hands. "I have to break the lock," Abelardo mouthed, his jaw tight. "I need my right hand for the wrench." Vashti went entirely still against his back. "If you let go with your right hand, you are holding us entirely with a shattered wrist." "I know. The bone will compound. It will tear through the skin." "I know," Abelardo repeated, his voice barely a rasp. "But if those boots find the pod bay empty, they'll start checking the maintenance shafts. We have 30 seconds before they look down this hole." He didn't give her time to argue. Abelardo leaned his chest against the ladder, pressing his sternum into the cold, greasy metal to create friction. He slid his left arm further over the rung, wedging his elbow deeply into the corner where the rung met the bulkhead. He took a short, jagged breath. "Hold on," he commanded. Abelardo uncurled his right hand from the rung. The immediate transfer of weight was catastrophic. 200 pounds dropped squarely onto his left elbow. The plasteel splint under the electrical tape cracked. Abelardo felt the broken ends of his radius bone grind together, slip and then violently shear sideways. A sickening, wet tearing sound echoed in his own ears, louder than the boots above. A scream tore out of his throat, raw and animalistic, but he bit down on his own tongue to muffle it. Hot blood filled his mouth. Dark spots swarmed his vision, the green glow of the chemical light fading into blackness. His body wanted to pass out. It begged to shut down. No, Abelardo forced his eyes open. He reached down to his belt with a trembling right hand, his fingers slipping on his own sweat before closing around the heavy steel wrench. He brought it up his muscles, screaming in protest. He aimed for the steel housing of the deadbolt. He swung. Clang. The impact sent a shockwave down his arm, jarring his broken wrist again. The deadbolt bent, but didn't break. Above them the footsteps stopped. A harsh, static-laced voice barked an order. They had heard the noise. "Hit it again!" Vashti hissed, her fingers digging like claws into his shoulders. She was trying to pull herself upward, trying desperately to take even an ounce of weight off his failing left arm. Abelardo drew the wrench back. He tasted copper and bile. He visualized Gideon Lewis's smug, immaculate face sitting in the command chair. He swung with every single shred of strength he had left in his right arm. Crack! The steel housing shattered. The deadbolt sheared off, dropping heavily onto Abelardo's shoulder before tumbling down into the dark abyss of the shaft. Abelardo dropped the wrench. He slammed his right palm flat against the grate and shoved upward. The heavy mesh swung open, screaming on unoiled hinges. "Go!" Abelardo gasped, his left arm finally giving out. The muscle simply stopped working. They began to fall. Vashti moved with the desperate, frantic energy of a cornered predator. She reached up, grabbing the edge of the open floor grate with both hands. Her arms snapped taut, arresting their fall just as Abelardo's left arm slipped off the rung. The utility cable jerked tight, slamming Abelardo violently into the wall of the shaft. He hung there, dangling by the chest harness, all his weight suspended from Vashti's grip on the deck above. "Climb!" She screamed, her face contorted in agony as the rough steel of the deck cut into her palms. The muscles in her back corded, fighting to hold a grown man in heavy gear while dragging a shredded leg. Abelardo didn't hesitate. He swung his right arm up, hooking his fingers into the deck plating. He found a foothold on the top rung, pushed and hauled himself over the lip of the shaft. He collapsed onto the cold deck of level 2, dragging Vashti up beside him. They lay there for a fraction of a second, a tangled heap of utility cable blood and exhausted, gasping lungs. "Hey over there." The shout came from 50 yards down the corridor. Abelardo looked up. Through the strobing red emergency lights, he saw 3 figures in heavy tactical armor. They wore the matte black insignias of the Praetorian Guard, Lewis's men. The lead guard raised a plasma rifle, the barrel glowing with a lethal, hypercharged blue hue. "Move!" Abelardo snarled. He didn't bother standing. He grabbed Vashti by the collar of her compression tunic and dragged her across the slick floor. The deck was freezing, polished smooth, which made sliding her easier, but left a glaring, wet smear of red blood in their wake. A plasma bolt shrieked past Abelardo's ear, the heat so intense it singed the fine hairs on the back of his neck. It struck the bulkhead behind them, exploding in a shower of molten slag and blinding white sparks. The smell of vaporized metal instantly overpowered the scent of copper and dust. They scrambled around the corner, diving into the alcove of the executive pod bay. The blast doors to the pod bay were massive, painted with the Sovereign's crest in faded gold. To the right of the doors sat a heavy red analog lever, a manual override completely disconnected from the ship's compromised mainframe. Abelardo threw his weight against the lever. It was stiff, frozen from years of disuse and the plummeting temperature. He slammed his right shoulder into it, screaming in frustration. The lever groaned, then snapped downward. The hydraulic seals on the doors released with a deafening hiss. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to part. "They're coming," Vashti said. She was sitting propped against the bulkhead, her hands pressed tightly against her thigh. The pressure bandage Abelardo had applied was completely soaked through the blood, now dripping steadily onto the deck. Her face was grey, the eyes sunken. She was bleeding out. "I know," Abelardo grunted, wedging his fingers into the gap between the doors and pulling, trying to force them open faster. The gap widened just enough. Abelardo grabbed Vashti by the harness, hauling her through the opening and onto the grated floor of the pod bay. It was dark inside, illuminated only by the standby lights of a single massive executive escape pod. It was a sleek, aerodynamic cylinder, designed to punch through atmospheric entry and land safely on a planetary surface. He dragged her to the open hatch of the pod and hoisted her inside. The interior smelled like pristine vinyl and stale canned air. It was a sterile, cramped space, dominated by 2 shock-absorbent crash couches. Abelardo practically threw her into the nearest couch. He didn't bother with gentle maneuvers. He grabbed the heavy 5-point restraint harness and slammed the buckles into place across her chest and waist. "Your arm!" she gasped, her eyes fixing on his left sleeve. Abelardo didn't look at it. He couldn't. If he looked, the shock would finally overtake him. "Forget the arm." He threw himself into the pilot's couch, his right hand flying across the analog switchboard. He didn't know flight telemetry, but he knew basic engineering layouts. Power on. Internal scrubbers active. Seal hatch. The heavy pod door slammed shut, sealing them in a pressurized cocoon. The sudden silence was absolute, cutting off the wailing emergency klaxons of the dying flagship. Then a heavy metallic thud shook the pod. Abelardo looked at the viewport. Through the thick, reinforced glass, he saw the Praetorian guards storming into the bay. One of them raised a plasma torch, stepping toward the pod's outer hatch. "They're going to cut the hinges," Vashti said, her voice hollow. Abelardo's hand hovered over the launch sequence buttons. There were 3 toggles and a primary ignition button. He flipped the toggles. A red warning light flashed on the console. External bay doors closed. Launch aborted. Abelardo swore viciously. The outer bay doors, the ones that opened into the vacuum of space, were still sealed. The ship's automated systems were dead, which meant the pod's launch computer wouldn't fire the thrusters and risk detonating inside the hull. He looked around frantically. Beneath the console, hidden under a yellow hazard cover, was a heavy mechanical T-handle. The manual explosive bolt release. "Brace yourself," Abelardo barked. "What are you doing?" "Blowing the door manually." He reached down with his right hand, gripping the T-handle. He pulled. Nothing happened. It was a dual-action release. It required two hands to twist and pull simultaneously to prevent accidental deployment. Abelardo stared at the handle. He looked at his left arm, hanging limp and useless at his side. The sleeve was soaked in dark, drying blood. He could feel the jagged edge of his broken radius pressing against the skin from the inside. Outside the viewport, the plasma torch flared to life. Orange sparks showered over the glass. They had minutes, maybe seconds. "Read," Vashti said softly. Abelardo didn't look at her. He leaned forward, wrapping his right hand around the left side of the handle. He took a deep breath, fighting the wave of nausea that threatened to empty his stomach. He brought his left arm up. He couldn't grip with his fingers. The nerves were entirely numb. Instead, he wedged his shattered wrist under the right side of the handle, using the broken joint itself as a hook. "Don't do it," Vashti choked out, realizing what he was about to do. "You'll destroy the arm permanently. You'll lose the hand. Better a hand than my head," Abelardo growled. He closed his eyes. He twisted his torso violently to the right, using his entire body weight to force his broken wrist upward, while his right hand pulled. The pain was beyond comprehension. It wasn't a sharp spike. It was a vast, crushing ocean of agony that drowned his consciousness. He felt the bone finally tear through the skin, hot blood spilling rapidly over his knuckles. But the handle turned. A deafening concussive boom rattled the pod to its rivets. The explosive bolt securing the pod to the bay floor detonated. Simultaneously, the explosive charges on the external bay doors blew, ripping the heavy durasteel plating outward into the void of space. The sudden catastrophic decompression of the bay created a violent vacuum. The pod was sucked outward, violently ejected from the belly of the dying flagship. Abelardo was thrown back into his couch, the sheer G-force pinning him against the vinyl. He didn't have time to buckle his restraints. He bounced hard against the side of the cockpit, his head striking the console. Through the viewport, the broken, jagged remains of the Reliant receded rapidly into the black distance, surrounded by a cloud of frozen debris and flashing plasma bolts that missed their mark. Then there was only the deep, profound silence of the void. Abelardo lay slumped against the console, his chest heaving, his left arm, a mangled, bloody ruin resting in his lap. The adrenaline was rapidly crashing, leaving nothing but cold, brutal exhaustion. He slowly turned his head. Vashti was strapped into a couch. The violent launch had jostled her severely, but she was alive. The heavy pressure bandage was holding. She was staring at him. Not with the cold, calculating gaze of a sovereign, nor the terror of a victim. She looked at him with an expression of profound, quiet awe. "You!" She started, her voice breaking. She looked at his ruined arm, then up to his face. "You broke yourself." "For me." Abelardo closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold vinyl. The metallic smell of blood filled the tiny cabin, but underneath it, he could smell the faint ozone scent of her perfume again. "I told you," Abelardo murmured, his voice fading to a rough whisper. "I'm just aggressively stubborn." A single tear cut a clean track through the ash and grime on Vashti's cheek. She reached out across the narrow space between the couches, her trembling fingers finding his right hand. She didn't say a word. She just held on. For the first time since the hull breached, Abelardo didn't pull away. They drifted into the dark, a shattered engineer and a broken queen, leaving the Empire behind. Thank you for surviving this intense journey into the dark corners of the core worlds. If you felt every bone-crunching, heart-pounding moment of Abelardo and Vashti's escape, make sure to smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Want to know what happens to Gideon Lewis, or how they survive the void? Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next thrilling sci-fi drama. Drop a comment below telling me your favorite moment, and share this video with a friend who loves gritty, human-focused storytelling. See you in the next universe.